This is the 1983 R80ST swing arm, and it's designed for a monoshock, so it just has the one leg that the shaft drive fits inside. Now it's attached with a pivot bolt like this and secured with a lock nut that goes around the pivot bolt. And I rebuilt and put in new swing arm bearings. Now what I like to do when I install the pivot bolt is just put the nut on the edge like that, and then I can screw it in to the frame, and I use an Allen to spin it in. Now I put a little wheel bearing grease on the pivot, and I'll just pick the rear swing arm up, slide it in like this, and then I can run the bolt in and catch the threads on one side. There we go. And then do the same on the other side. There it goes. Always a little bit finicky. Okay. So I'm going to use a vernier caliper, and I want to measure the gap between the edge of the swing arm and the inside edge of the bushing in the frame where the pivot bolt goes. And I do that on both sides because I want the swing arm centered in the frame. Now this has given me about 4.36 millimeter. I'll check the other side. And that's about 409. So the swing arm is pushed too far this way, so I'll loosen this pivot bolt and tighten the other and move it in this direction. Now I'm going to torque the pivot bolts to 15 foot-pounds, and I tightened up each a little bit and a little bit on each side. Okay, that's at 15. Okay, they're both torqued to 15, and now I'll recheck the distance to be sure that it hasn't moved very much. So now that I preloaded the bearings by torquing the pivot bolts to 15 foot-pounds, I backed them off incrementally to where they were a little bit loose again and remeasured the gap, and I'm still at about 4.3 millimeters. So now I'm going to set the final torque, which is 7.5 foot-pounds. So I use an inch-pound wrench to set it, and I tighten them up incrementally. So I'll keep the gap that I've got correct. And you just keep alternating between the two sides. And then when you get to the 7.5, you go back and measure it again to make sure the gaps are even. And if they aren't, loosen them up and adjust it a little bit and torque it again to 7.5 foot-pounds. Okay, that's 7.5, and that's 7.5, and then I'll remeasure. After I measured, I had to make a little bit of an adjustment, so I backed the this pivot bolt back a little and tightened the other, and I got them where they're right at 4.3, and then made sure they're at 7.5 foot-pounds on the pivot bolt. Now the lock nut needs to be torqued to about 75 to 80 foot-pounds, but it's a very small space in there, so I use a cut-down socket that will fit inside the housing and around the nut. So I'm going to set it to 75 foot-pounds on each side. There we go. Okay, so the swing arm is now installed, and the next step is to attach the drive shaft to the output flange on the transmission. Now the other thing I did was I used a jack stand and a couple of wood blocks so I can support the swing arm just about level, which makes it much easier to get the bolt through the drive shaft into the output flange on the transmission. So I'm ready to attach the drive shaft here to the output flange on the transmission. And what goes over that is a bellows. And at the top on one side it says oben, which means top. And then down at the bottom on the same side, it's German for transmission. But in all honesty, this is round, and so's the flange on the transmission. And this is square, and so is the flange on the drive shaft. So it's pretty straightforward to get it in there. So I just make sure oben is at the top, and I'll just slide this in between and get it set before I attach the bolts. So I've got the boot on, and I pushed it so that it's on the swing arm, so I can pull it back like this, so I can get the bolts that attach the drive shaft to the transmission output flange on. So to make it a little easier to get the bolts in, I used a couple of bungee cords, and I caught the edge of the bellows to pull it back. Now these bolts already have Loctite on them. If yours don't, you can use some blue Loctite on the threads before you put them in, and that'll ensure that they don't come loose. And then I get the flange from the drive shaft centered on the nut on the transmission, and then I can stick a bolt in the hole, line them up, and tighten them up with my fingers. And just continue to rotate the shaft a little bit till the next bolt hole shows up, and work my way around until I get all 4 of them on there. After I get the bolts snug, I put the transmission in first gear, and I use a ground down 10mm box that'll just fit in there. And you can't get a torque wrench on there very easily, so what I do is I lean on it until it actually hurts, and I put a little bit of a dent in my hand so it's tight, and then I use a little white paint, and I put a little paint dot on that bolt to prove that I've torqued it. Then I put the transmission in neutral, rotate it till the next bolt comes up, and go all the way around till I get all 4 of them torqued. So I've got the boot attached now to the transmission housing, and of course I had it attached to the swing arm, and the straps are on. The way I install the straps is I just unscrew the screw, open it up, and slide it over. Now the other thing is I had to take the battery box out because I can't get access all the way around unless the battery box is out of the way. And the other thing I learned is I think when you want to do this, you should attach the bellows to the swing arm before you install the swing arm. it's a lot easier than trying to get the bellows on the swing arm when the swing arm is installed. So that's the lesson I learned on this bike. Now, the rear drive on the 83 R80ST does not use a gasket to seal the swing arm to the rear drive. Instead, you use a particular gasket material to seal. Now, I'm using a Permatex product 518-13, and it's equivalent to the Loctite product 518, which is what BMW recommends. And it's a two-part system. There's a surface preparation spray that goes on one surface, and then the gasket making material goes on the other surface. So that's what I'll do when I install the rear drive. Now, due to the studs on the rear drive, I'm going to spray this mating surface with the surface prep, because you only spray one surface, and then I'll apply the gasket material to the swing arm flange, which doesn't have these studs. The other thing is I cleaned both mating surfaces with brake cleaner a couple of times because I want it absolutely dead clean, and I checked and there are no nicks or scratches or anything on either mating surface, so that should be an oil-tight seal when I get done. Now, before I install the rear drive, I test fit it and rotated the drive a little bit until the splines on the drive mate with the splines on the drive shaft. That way, when I go to put it together, I won't be fumbling trying to get everything to line up. So I've got the drive on, and these are actually stainless bolts, so I put anti-seize on the studs. Now, the torque spec's about 48 foot-pounds. I'm going to derate it to 40. And this one right here, you can't get a torque wrench on it because the bracket for the rear monoshock is in the way. So the only thing I can think of is to get a box end on it and just really lean on it to get it tight after I get the others torqued. So that one's real problematic. So I actually wasn't able to get the torque wrench on this one either. So I used my 12 box end, and I just really whacked on it a little bit to get these two really tight. So the rear drive is installed. Now, where the sealant squeezed out, I used lacquer thinner and a blue shop towel and cleaned it up to get rid of it. So I have a new YSS rear shock that I'm going to install, and I reset my jack so that the distance between the top and bottom mounts is just about right. And then the bolts will go through, and the wave washers, and then there's a lock nut. So it's pretty straightforward to install. Now I'm torquing the bolts to 32 foot-pounds. There we go, and I'll get the top one. Okay, the swing arm's installed, the rear drive's installed. You notice a little red tape on the filler bolts to remind me I haven't put any gear lube in those yet. And the rear shock is installed. So it's beginning to look more and more like a real motorcycle.